the real value that Bitcoin has. It's not that it's an asset. It's not that it's digital. It's that it's an alternative to current governments. 2013, PayPal spent $800 million acquiring Venmo. But what if they had taken that money and done something, in the Bitcoin space? For a lot of people, it was a bridge too far, a bit too crazy. I understand that some people feel that way now about this idea of creating new countries.
Berkeley, how are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you, Kyle?
I'm fantastic. A little jealous of the sunlight and fresh air. We had about 5 minutes of it for the last 3 days up here in Seattle, but you're coming in from El Salvador. And why don't you just give us a little bit on your background and where you're coming from into this conversation?
Yeah, sure. So trying to keep it somewhat short. I grew up in the U.S. Grew up, very, very white American family on an island in Maine with a national park. And probably like one of the first things I did that was really different was when I was 20, after I had been studying abroad for like semester of exchanges, I decided to do my undergrad in Chile. This was 2006 or seven. I thought, education in the U.S. was overpriced, and that I thought anyone that I would like to work with in the future would think that that was a really cool thing I had done with my life, and anyone I wouldn't want to work with in the future would think that was stupid. So it would be like a nice filter. It's funny because now when I tell people that, a lot of people say, "Oh yeah, I totally agree," but back in 2007, that wasn't such a popular decision to decide that education in the U.S. was overpriced. So I did that when I graduated, or I guess maybe I should say, well, while I was studying there, uh, I had a little bit of an interest in economics. I Then the financial crisis happened, and I realized there was a lot I still didn't understand. I would have been maybe 24 at the time, or something, 22, something like that. And yeah, I tried to understand more what happened with the financial crisis. That sort of led me to a lot of things about currency, central banking, and then because of that, when I saw something about Bitcoin for the first time in 2010, because I had done those other things, I was able to understand it. I think without that curiosity about what happened with the financial crisis that led me to a lot of other things and other rabbit holes, I probably would have read about Bitcoin and had no interest whatsoever. And about a year later, I had graduated at that point with some friends. We started a Bitcoin exchange called TradeHill. And at the time, 2011, 2012, it was the number two Bitcoin exchange in the world. We received some investment, and that investment included the domain bitcoin.com. This is, as far as I understand, this is before any um, involvement that Roger Ver had with the domain. So I don't have any connection with him. But yeah, basically we had to close down because we needed a lot of money for legal things, including becoming a money transmitter. In 2012, there was not huge investments being made in the Bitcoin space yet. And so I did that. I spent some more time in Chile. I did a little work with universities and consulting. Then I moved back to the US. I managed a real estate project that included co-living in San Francisco, and it was a co-living space focused on tech, crypto, and art. A lot of there before I was there, there was also a co-working space where they had a lot of cryptocurrency related meetups. Met a lot of really cool people there, and it also kind of got me thinking about the tribal nature of humans. Left San Francisco 2019 and spent 3 years in Colombia, in Medellin, and then I was back in the U.S. for a little bit, and currently in El Salvador. I've been here a few months, and around, I guess it was 2021, I got very interested in Balaji's ideas around a network state, which I think something we'll be talking about some. And I was in Balaji's sort of online version, precursor online community before you do something in the physical world of a network state called 1729. And I was more recently at his network school in close to Singapore for a month as well.
You've got a broad background, man. And a couple things. One is I grew up on an island here in Washington State. You're from an island in Maine, so the opposite side of the country, basically different countries. Um,
That's
and I
cool.
just, as you were talking about the price of education, there's some alignment here. I looked up just how the rising cost of college has outpaced inflation. So it's, I mean, I don't know what the cost of college was in 2006, but by the time I got to college in 2013, it was like an average of $50,000, $60,000 a year. And it's only getting more expensive. Meanwhile, from my perception today, the value of that degree is much less than it was a couple decades ago, where maybe my parents' generation, it would land you a great job and sort of open more doors. Today, it's like you get out of college, you're basically at square one. So, the other thing I was going to mention is the 2008 crisis. I read a book. What was it? Oh man, The Big Short. When I was 16 years old, I read The Big Short, and I just couldn't. It actually woke me up to how corrupt Wall Street was, and just how. And then the movie came out later too, and that highlighted it. But I remember laughing out loud reading some of these like little excerpts of, just how just loose and basically right on the line of criminal some of these activities were around credit default obligations and things like that. But um, so you're a Bitcoin OG then. I guess my first question is, from a Bitcoin OG perspective, what are a couple lessons for somebody who's new to Bitcoin um, that hasn't maybe been through multiple cycles like you have?
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that I might say is patience, specifically with other people. So when I talked a little bit about things that I've done, you might have noticed that I started a Bitcoin exchange earlier on, and then there wasn't like that didn't last for super long. There wasn't a lot of Bitcoin related projects after that. I think for me, I went through a period where I learned about it, I got it, I didn't just buy it, but I was working in the space sort of full time for a year, and it kind of really impacted me that why aren't other people getting this? Why like how is this not a bigger thing yet? And I think now I would like to think that I've learned a little bit more patience in that respect. That for a lot of people around us, it might take hearing about things a lot before they really get curious or before they take their first actions. So I guess part of it might be patience with the people in the world around you. Would be one thing that I would say. I mean, I guess from there going into more practical, thinking about what works for you in terms of self custody, keeping coins on an exchange, etc. I mean, I do think that over the long term, it's better to move more towards a self custody. But if you're just getting started, that might not be where you're at right now. That's okay, and just try to keep learning, and in the same way that you would try to be patient with others while they're learning about things that you're excited about. Also, be patient with yourself, and don't get yourself into a situation where you lose a seed phrase because you tried to jump the gun.
Two very good lessons, two very good pieces of advice. I just did an episode at the Bitcoin hardware store when we actually met, as you know, in El Salvador recently. And I talked with Gabe, who's one of the guys that works there with Ronnie. And his recommendation was start the self custody process from day one, um, which it sounds almost intimidating. And I think one of the pieces of advice that I share with people is like whatever your strategy is in terms of accumulating or stacking Bitcoin, it needs to be sustainable like a diet. Yeah, sure, you could cut everything out, all the bad stuff like right away, but is that going to be something that you can stick with, or are you going to just eventually throw in the towel and give up? So I do think patience is a huge, huge lesson. I'm always curious with folks that have been, hammering the table for years and years about this stuff. Do you get tired of, hearing the same criticisms about Bitcoin that have been I hate to use the word, but debunked over and over again. Like the oceans are boiling, or Bitcoin is for criminals. Like these things that
Or it's like tulips and
it's like tulips. It's the greater
and
fool theory. It's just a bubble. Things like that. Um, so have you built conviction more and more over the long term? Like since 2010, did you ever have uh, an imagination that we'd be where we are today in 2024 with strategic reserves and institutional adoption and some of these like major levers being pulled?
yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, remembering back what it was like when I was first learning about all this, I mean, it's always hard to predict the future, but certainly in that time, it was hard to see how things might go. Um, I mean, I think then obviously it was a lot smaller, and there wasn't legal clarity on a lot of things. So I think there were a lot of concerns in terms of, what what's going to happen here. I even remember like an anecdote of someone I know where someone who was more in traditional finance, said like, "Oh, well, either you're going to be billionaires or you're going to be riding some camel to Bolivia somewhere," and that wasn't exactly true, but it sort of made a point. So yeah, I mean, I think in the early days there were a lot more concerns. I think I did understand in a lot of ways things like a block explorer. I know you said you have sort of a mix of knowledge in your audience. So, I mean, just briefly, Block Explorer is a great way to see what's happening with the Bitcoin transaction without having to depend on a third party like a bank or another person. Essentially shows you with math what the status of the transaction is. So, I mean, I think seeing something like that early on, and then also seeing how things like international wire transfers worked, I definitely got that. I definitely got a lot of the advantages that this had over a system like the dollar or the Federal Reserve. Um, you know, I think the thing that I didn't really understand or was harder to visualize, since you were sort of talking about what I thought the future might look like, is yeah, I mean, when we were doing our exchange, the price of a Bitcoin was anywhere between, $33 and $2. I remember we had a big spike all the way up to $33. And, at the time, if you had told me, oh, a little bit more than 10 years from now, we'll be at $100,000, I think psychologically that would have been a little hard for me to process, to digest. And, I mean, I was involved in starting a Bitcoin exchange young, but I did not have any sort of, serious investment background. So the idea of understanding how much an asset could change in price over time wasn't something that I really had the knowledge for at the time.
That makes a lot of sense. I was going to ask you, you mentioned, we're talking a little bit about how the future is uncertain. And that's something that I always stress as a reason to have some Bitcoin is because the future is uncertain. I mean, in traditional finance, they call it, a diversified portfolio, but Bitcoin is more than just a financial asset. So maybe talk a little bit about, given the fact that the future is uncertain, what are some of the reasons to own Bitcoin other than number go up?
Yeah, sure. So what I kind of the phrasing that I've been using recently is I'll say, well, if you learned about Bitcoin and your takeaway is that it's an asset, you might have missed the point. If you have, money in a bank account, you essentially have a promise from the bank. If you have physical cash, you essentially have, a promise from the government. And, just a few years ago in India, we saw that the bills that they had in circulation, the cash in the economy, they announced that I think it was like the next week, those bills weren't going to have any value anymore because a lot of people were storing cash and they were trying to tax that economy more. So, whether it's cash, whether it's money in a bank account, essentially what you have is promises. And then same thing for stocks. And then on top of that, all of those assets, if you want to move them, you need permission from a bank, a government, maybe a regulatory agency, um, even from the engineering perspective. You can't, you need the permission of those organizations to move those assets. So I think the way I kind of look at it is it's like, well, I think nothing's perfect, but if you're looking for an asset that you can actually have custody of yourself, that you can move to other people without having to ask, various other entities for permission, that's what I see the value of something like Bitcoin as. So the more TradFi traditional finance way of saying that is that there's no counterparty risk if you're holding your own Bitcoin. Um, so that would be essentially besides number go up. That would be my answer as to why I would support having at least some Bitcoin.
Great. Very well said. My girlfriend was asking me last night, why am I so, she called it worried. I guess I come across as worried, more wary of the future and the potential for tyrannical overreach in numerous ways. And I said, just read history, just look at,
Yeah.
or not even history, just look at other places in the world currently, like you just mentioned, India, Argentina's a recent example of places where hyperinflation occurred, or currency debasement gets out of control, or war breaks out, and all of a sudden you need to move your family, or you have political opinions that don't align with the powers that be, or you get debanked. Right here in the U.S., President Trump, his wife Ivanka, I believe, was debanked, which means that nobody is immune from these things, where the human life is so short that we don't always think that it could happen here, type of thing. So that's why I really stress that the future is uncertain, and what you want is optionality. Bitcoin gives you that optionality. If you heard me say Bitcoin is not an asset, it's a technology, is that something that resonates with you? Like Bitcoin is a technology at the end of the day?
Yeah, yeah, I would say yes. Um, I might say something like it's it's like an expression of ideas that have been around for a while, but with newer tools, something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, essentially, what you're saying that it's a technology.
Yeah, and
Um,
technologies solve problems, and the biggest, best technologies solve the hardest, longest lasting challenges, right? And I believe that currency debasement, if you look back in history, is something that humans have had to deal with forever, since basically the institution of civilization altogether. And yeah, so I
yeah,
guess
I
yeah, go
mean,
ahead.
my hope too is I might add that in terms of worries about the future, hopefully things like Bitcoin will have enough of like a check and a balance on things so that they don't get out of control. Um, I sort of feel this way myself about I know this is like a different controversial topic, but people legally owning guns.
Mm,
That I look at the last 100 years. I see China, I see the Soviet Union, I see the U.S. Three places in the world that in the last 100 years have had a lot of money, people, and power. China had Mao, Soviet Union had Stalin. The U.S. doesn't have anyone in that universe. And let's say there's like a 20% chance that that's because a lot of people own guns legally in the U.S. To me, that sounds like a pretty good trade off. And so hopefully, with something like Bitcoin, ideally you get into it yourself, but even if you don't, you might be benefiting by the people that are into it, the people that are participating in this, creating a bit of a limit on the power that other systems might have to get out of control.
I think it's a great point. It's the Admiral Isoro Yamamoto from Japan said, "You cannot invade mainland United States. There would be a rifle behind every blade of grass." And we have obviously the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And then, in my view, I mean, look at the difference between Australia, Canada, and the US during COVID. You could argue, which I would probably take this position, that the United States evaded some of the tyranny because of the Second Amendment, where it's like, yeah, you want to shut down my business? Like, you can try. Like, there were people that actually just said, no, you're not shutting down my business. Not that they, physically defended it with guns or something like that, but just the threat there of the government cannot simply just go in and, like they did in China, just bar doors closed on apartment complexes and force everybody into a complete lockdown. I'm very black pilled in some sense, but also white pilled because of the fact that the United States was able to maintain some level of rights for their citizens. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, and once again, I would say too, I might not know that with 100% certainty, but if it's like a 20% chance, that's still something.
Absolutely. I
So
like
yeah,
percentages, not taking too hard of a black and white perspective. I want to, so let's talk about network states. What is a network state? Could you describe it?
sure. So maybe what I'll try to do is I'll try to give sort of the technical definition, and then more of like a simple definition.
Yeah.
So the more technical one would be something like uh, a community of people with shared values and principles and the ability to take action together, starting off online and then moving into the physical world and acquiring land to essentially build new countries that would be dots of land across the world instead of one land mass, and that these would be countries that would use cryptocurrency as a currency. I know this is a Bitcoin related podcast, but there'll definitely be people in the network state movement that are more interested in other crypto assets besides Bitcoin. So that would be a little bit like the technical definition. Balaji Srinivasan is the person that came up with these concepts. And then one of the ways that I kind of like to think about it a little bit more simply for people that like Bitcoin is, at its core, to me, the real value that Bitcoin has, as we were saying before, it's not that it's an asset, it's not that it's digital, it's that it's an alternative to current governments. And that's something that I think a lot of people missed for a long time. And, while that's great, I think what happens is, you put down your phone with your Bitcoin wallet and you might talk to other people that have Bitcoin. You might see a country like El Salvador adopting Bitcoin as a currency. But we don't see, we haven't seen governments changing radically and improving, while Bitcoin's been around. And the way I see a network state is taking a lot of the ideas of Bitcoin or even of Ethereum and expanding that to a world of buildings, hardware, land, communities, and not just software.
So we talked about Bitcoin as a technology solving problems. The idea of a network state, I like just the analogy to a startup society,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which I think that two things that I wrote down on that is number one, a startup society allows for reimagination without tearing down the current paradigms. So in many people's heads, including my own, it's like if we want to see change, we need to burn the bridges that we currently have, tear down the current paradigm, and have a revolution of some type. Whereas a startup society is not necessarily challenging the powers that be or the current paradigm in that way. And number two, it attracts strong leaders like founders. Like one of the things that a network state sounds like is critical to a network state is a clear leader, which would be a high status and sought after position, which would attract talented, capable, hard driving people. But then with the element of shared values and blockchain transparency, maybe would prevent or curb some of the current downsides of a dictator or a monarch coming into power in a place. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. No, I mean the idea of startup society is good, and I mean I think I've thought of it before as we have this concept in the past from U.S. history of states being laboratories of democracy. So I think in some way something like a startup society or a network state might be like a laboratory of governance, where you try different things out. Um, So I think there's definitely that element to it. I think what you were touching on a little bit there is that, yeah, when you do read about, Balaji's ideas, at least, and Balaji's clear that you can take part of his ideas and change them as you want to. So, you could try to do a startup society or a network state that's very democracy based. But normally when Balaji talks about it, he does talk about it in the sense of a startup society founder and the way that you have a startup company founder. And my understanding of, okay, well, how do you then get at this question of the consent of the governed? I think would be one to look at what we have right now, where using you were both from the US as an example, regardless of what your or my political perspectives are on the US, it's safe to say that there's an awful lot of people in the US that don't feel like uh, they're being consented by the government, that they're getting, consent from the government. And, one really basic example of this is, like whoever won the last election, about half of the people are going to be upset about it. Um, so I think there's a lot of ways that, to the extent that democracy is supposed to get the consent of the governed, it isn't in its current way of doing things. And so I think the idea with network states would be that you sort of have more market competition for governments and societies, and that sure they have founders, which you might compare in some ways to a monarch, but that you preserve this right to exit, so that you can say, okay, well, I'm not a fan of this society, I'm going to go to that one. Whereas a country like the US right now, sure, I can travel to El Salvador, I can start living somewhere else. But in terms of not paying into that system for the rest of my life, that becomes more complex. I do think there are some questions on, how do we actually retain that right to exit over time? And I do think that's a very interesting area to explore. But yeah, I'm trying to remember your original question. Sorry.
I don't. I think it's well. Just it was great. You answered it.
Okay.
But I like what you're bringing up on this idea of the right to exit. I have a friend right now who is currently in the process of renouncing citizenship, and my understanding is that there's a 24% exit tax on all global assets, regardless of if you're a dual citizen, you earn them abroad, or whatever it might be, and just in general, taxation here in the US is so high. There's places where it's
Sure.
higher, sure, but I do believe that the future will be people seeking more sovereignty and freedom and ability to control their own destiny, or their own life, right? So how does that work with a network state? The right to exit's pretty easy if it's an online community. Um, I guess, and even just to go deeper, what is, I understand how like a blockchain would enforce rules in the blockchain in cyberspace, but what's the connection to the real world if there's a physical dispute, or if somebody's not paying their whatever fair share, or they do want to leave, or they're doing something that's not aligned with that network state? Like, is there, I guess some of the challenges that I could see, right, is enforcing physical laws, or enforcing laws in the physical world.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that I've thought about some here is, in the same way that when Bitcoin started, there was no network effect in Bitcoin. Um, while they had a lot of imperfections, we really needed bridges between the fiat world and the Bitcoin world. And I think that as we start seeing more things happening with network states, uh, there's also going to be a lot of importance in bridges between, we could call them legacy countries, fiat countries, and network states. And I think this is going to be a whole variety of things. I mean, one might be as simple, or not as simple, but as obvious as proof of human. One, are you say who you are? If we're going to be living together in a community, do you have some past of being like a rapist or a murderer that we should know about? So I mean, I think there are definitely going to be things where, in the same way that if you emigrate to, between one country to another, they want some sort of a background check from the country you came from. there probably will be a lot of things in the beginning that, in the same way we had those fiat currency to Bitcoin bridges, you will have these sort of fiat country to network state bridges where, we're figuring out how do we transition people over. Um, so I think that definitely will be a thing. And then yeah, in terms of also starting off in the beginning, this isn't going to be from day one that network states have complete sovereignty.
Right.
So I mentioned being at Balaji started what he calls the network school, close to Singapore, and that's within the borders of another legacy country. And at this point, I don't know all the details, but we didn't have our own military, we didn't have our own police force, etc. So I think there will be a lot of transition in the beginning, and I mean, one way to think of it might be too that there's an awful lot of countries right now that, in some way, a smaller country like El Salvador, they have to make a variety of agreements with other countries around the world. They can't just say, well, invade us if you want to. That wouldn't really be the best strategy. So one, there's that, and then I think two, there is this sort of interesting thing of yeah, if you get to how could a military or how could a network state defend its own boundaries, defend its own borders. It is this interesting paradigm where uh, if you talk too much about it, you're a threat. If you don't talk about it enough, you're a joke,
Mm.
and that is a little bit of a challenge. I do see that network states will probably have a lot of engineering talent, and then that might end up being a very important, not only engineering talent, but investors and visionaries that can come up with new technological based ways to defend territory. But yeah, there is always this thing where you talk too much about that, and suddenly you're a threat. You don't talk about it enough, and you're a joke, and that can kind of be a little bit of a fine line to walk, I think.
That's fascinating. Do network states, where do they spawn physically? Do they come out of Bitcoin hubs and crypto, like a place like Palau? I was listening to Balaji's podcast with
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, I believe it was like one of the administrators of the legal system and also the president of Palau. Like where, and also here I'll pull up in the actual podcast an image of what the network state looks like in one image. There's a website if you want to get more technical, more detail on this stuff. It's called thenetworkstate.com. And it just sort of visualizes how people will be geographically separated but connected via cyberspace. So yeah, where do these places tend to spawn?
So maybe one thing that would be interesting just to talk about what are sort of in the same way that when we learn about Bitcoin, we think about some of the precursors to Bitcoin.
Mm,
It might be interesting to think about, okay, well, what are some of the precursors to a network state?
interesting.
And as I mentioned, in a way, what it's really going after is innovation and governance. So, one place that might be interesting to look at, even though we're not exactly trying to copy it, is Singapore, where in a way Singapore was a startup country. It was sort of like a laboratory of government innovation that, China was sort of keeping an eye on, and was aware of what was going on as they were trying to move out of communism, or as a lot of people wanted to move out of communism. Maybe not everyone, of course. So I think looking at something like that is definitely interesting, and thinking about that there may very well be things um, where it is some kind of innovation, but in the same way that you have like a VC invest in a startup, maybe you do have a bigger country, making a deal with a network state or a startup society. I think it also might raise the question of, while I like this idea of different dots of land across the world as being a network state, maybe just because it's something we've seen before, maybe it'll end up being more like a startup city with one location than a bunch of dots. Maybe that's something that, if you're trying to raise funds to do, investors will be more comfortable with because they've been to just Singapore or Dubai and they're a little bit familiar with how something like that worked, whereas the other one's harder to visualize. And then we get the dots of land version later on. So that's a little bit of like where they could come from. And then I think, a lot of people who are interested in network states, they are sort of interested in what they see as current innovators and governments within current countries. So, we met in El Salvador. I would say a lot of the people here are definitely much more interested in Bitcoin if they came here. But there are a lot of people here that know what a network state is. Maybe they're starting to learn about it. And I don't think it's an accident that they came to a place that's already experimenting with innovation and governance. You see some interest in what Malay's doing, even though he's a little bit less cryptocurrency centric. I have seen he had some kind of an art piece in the central bank of Argentina that had something to do with Bitcoin that was pretty cool. And he's been innovating with getting rid of agencies. So yeah, I mean, I think there definitely will be this idea of the bridges between fiat countries and network state countries, and then so if we sort of move away from that, in a different way, where might this come from? But also looking at the past a little bit is essentially okay. We don't have the land yet, but we have some shared ideas. We're an online community. We're looking to crowdsource land together. So one example Balaji gives, and there's an interesting book that I've listened to part of about this, is that the Jewish religion started with this idea of wanting their own country and having these shared ideals of Judaism before they had Israel, and obviously there's a lot of debates about Israel, but for the purpose of network states, there is this idea of okay, well, you had these people with shared values. They didn't have land yet. They decided they wanted to. And then, over time, at first the book was kind of a joke, but over time as things started happening. So that's one example. I've also heard the example of, borrowing from India, where India had this peaceful revolution against the British, borrowing from the US, the ideas of concepts of, a constitution, not a tribe, having ideas that your country's based on. So I think there's a lot of different places, and the way, yeah, what might this look like in the current world? It might look like, people forming groups online, shared values, some sort of commitment, starting to maybe at first you're renting out different houses in different locations around the world. And this is all part of your community and you can move around between them. Maybe then you're buying the real estate. Maybe then as you move more, I like this metaphor of, in Bitcoin, you have full nodes and light nodes. They both have their purpose, but one's more sturdy than the other. As you start moving up, in the same way, at first you might just download a Bitcoin client. Later on, you're trying to figure out how to do a full node. Yeah, maybe in the beginning you're renting some different houses in different parts of the world. Then you're buying the property. Then you're buying land and developing an eco village with its own water source and food. So I think there's a lot of different ways that can go. I think one of the things that we might start seeing too is a lot of us are probably aware that a lot of countries are having financial difficulties. I think it's totally possible that we see countries selling off land for Bitcoin in the future, and that then gives you way more root control, to use the software analogy, over what you're doing than just buying a house or just buying a piece of land.
Yeah, I heard a idea floated around HOAs using Bitcoin, or Bitcoin centric HOAs, repurchasing land from different local governments that are in debt or that are struggling financially, and there's sort of a win-win there where the local government can capitalize on this land, and the people can surround themselves. Like, I'm thinking about being hopefully a dad in the next couple years. And one of the biggest things that I think about is, how do I surround my kids with other like-minded kids? I'm here in Seattle and I worry, if I put my kids here in school, if I put them in this middle school up the road, God only knows how they're going to turn out. You can do your best, but I'm just not aligned with the values of the people that live I have good neighbors here, and it's all good. But there's just I guess there's a pain point there for young people that are looking to provide a good life for the next generation, which I believe is one of our roles, if you're called to do so. So I guess the question then is, you talked about crowdsourcing land. I'm curious from a business perspective, like what is the business model of a network state? Like, is it is it receiving taxes or some type of contribution financially from the people that are part of it in exchange for goods and services, like a typical government goods services, usually, like building the roads and providing police and fire and these types of things. Like, um, I guess I'm putting on the investor hat of, if I
Sure.
were not only a crowdfunding member, but a potential investor like a Balaji or somebody who really wants to make change in the world, but also see upside. Um, what is the business model and how does the funding side of things work?
Yeah, no, so I mean, I do think you're right. You do have to think about how does this work monetarily. And, you mentioned a lot of your concerns about, what the schools in your area might look like. And I guess I might start with, the really broad perspective is we might not all agree on what these alternatives look like. But I think right now, I've noticed talking to people, if I think about me talking to people about Bitcoin 10 years ago versus me talking to people about network states now, um, it was actually a lot harder talking about Bitcoin back
Interesting.
then. And I think part of that was people didn't realize and probably still don't realize exactly how broken the dollar as a system is because it's a little bit harder to understand. But a lot of people are very aware that while we might not agree exactly on what, they look at the government and the society they're living in, and they're not exactly thrilled with what's going on. Whether it's basic safety or education, etc. So I think the first thing to establish is that I think there's definitely a demand for better alternatives, and then yeah, from there you would have to figure out what kind of alternatives can a network state or a startup society provide that people would pay for um, to make it, monetarily work. And yeah, I mean the school one you posted on or you mentioned, I think right now the tweet that I have pinned on my Twitter is something. It's a picture of when I got to the network school, and there's Brian Johnson and Balaji and Vitalik and other people looking at them, and I think I say something like a lot of people are talking about wanting an equivalent to Stanford, an alternative to Stanford. Some people are actually trying to build it, referring to the people in the picture. And so, yeah, I mean, I think definitely education. There's a lot of people looking at what's going on right now, and they're not thrilled about sending their kids to public school or Ivy League schools. They want a different alternative. So I think that's definitely an obvious area where um, people are already paying for those things. Um, and then yeah, I mean for a lot of people too, it's safety. So I mean, obviously you can move. There are still parts of the U.S. that are safe, and other parts that are less safe. You mentioned me being in El Salvador here. Just the other day, I saw that they've had zero homicides in December. It's a country of little context. I mean, 6 million people, so definitely not as big as the U.S. But that's an area where a lot of people would pay to move to somewhere safer. So that's definitely an area that network states could work on. I think there's also I've thought a lot about health. So I
Mm,
am in El Salvador right now. There's a lot of things I like about it. Um, what one thing that I have dealt with here and other places is if you're moving somewhere and you're not buying a house yet, you're not customizing the house for you yet. Well, in El Salvador, you can't drink the tap water. I end up drinking bottled water out of plastic bottles. Yeah, sure, I could try to figure all that out on my own, but I think there's a lot of things where the first 3 to 6 months of moving somewhere, there's a lot of pain points that can be helped with some sort of community where it's like, where if you show up and it's like, oh, there's a gym, oh, there's a restaurant that doesn't have seed oils, which, you don't even have in most countries now, period.
Right.
Oh, there's, the water is already filtered and maybe doesn't have fluoride in it or whatever. I think there's a lot of these things where maybe they become a little bit easier to figure out after a year or two. Even then, they can be difficult. But that first half of the year can be really difficult to figure out a lot of those things. Also to do things like, um, finding a business community, finding a social community, if you're single, dating. So I think any sort of support you have for those things, I think are probably monetizable. Um, yeah, I mean, honestly, there's a whole host of things. Another thing I've thought about a decent amount as someone that's been a digital nomad, and I don't know if you've dealt with this yourself, but is this idea of, at least for now, while we have these bridges between fiat and network state countries, needing to have some sort of address in the US, ideally that you can show a utility bill for, etc. And, I think a standalone solution for that could be a little bit hard. But let's say you have a startup society with different locations around the world, you might be able to say, well, when I'm in the US, the place I spend my time at, or at least half of my time, is the branch of the startup society that we have in the US. That's now my physical address in the US, as opposed to having to try to use like a family member that might not, it's not like logistically easy. So I think the like proof of address in a fiat country, not only your own, but the one you weren't born in, but you do business in, could definitely be something. I think a lot of like payment gateways for businesses between crypto and fiat in that country could be helpful. I've had a lot of experiences in Latin America where someone wants you to pay them in a local bank transfer, and you don't have a bank account there. Obviously, I like Bitcoin, but not everyone accepts it. That's just part of the reality. So yeah, honestly, I think there is an awful lot of services that you can offer. And it is true that you will have to find ways to monetize them. That's why I think some things like I mentioned the proof of address one, like obviously you set that up in a state if you're doing it in the US that doesn't have state taxes. And then, okay, well now you're already like providing some savings there. Um, so that's a little bit about how I thought of it. But there's an awful lot left to think about. I've also thought about more simple things of theoretically government regulators are supposed to maybe keep us safe from poison buildings, poison food,
Mm.
etc. I think a lot of us feel that they're not really doing a great job of that. So that could also be something where if you're participating in a startup society or a network state and they have different locations they've built around the world, they can show some sort of proof that the building materials are not toxic. And I think for a lot of people that would have a monetary value. I think there's also angles you could take on different kinds of technology and innovation that people are working on that in their own home country they might have a lot of limitations on, and you might be able to provide some sort of a more sovereign option for that. So I think there's an awful lot of hopefully that answers some of those questions, but I think there's an awful lot of services. But it is true that in the beginning we will have this challenge of a lot of people. I'm from the U.S. They might still be paying taxes to the U.S. while they're paying for services from a network state, and obviously that is a challenge that other businesses don't face. When I go to a restaurant, there's not some other restaurant that's forcing me to pay them as well. So that is a challenge that we'll have to confront for sure.
I have so many ideas, so many thoughts on what you were just
I'd
saying.
love to hear some of them. Yeah,
But yeah, I guess before we move on too much, one of the topics that we were throwing back and forth before the episode was on how network states could redefine real estate as an investment class. There's a lot of discussion in the Bitcoin space around real estate being demonetized because people use real estate as a store of value. And just because we were talking about the business model and investment case for, leading and being an early investor in one of these places, like how do you think about that as in terms of redefining real estate itself?
sure. So I've sort of come up with this idea that's part of a longer talk. Um, I've definitely heard bits and pieces other places, but I feel like part of it I came up with on my own. That that what a lot of people missed about like a lot of people missed a lot of things about Bitcoin. So I'm once again doing the like comparing Bitcoin to network
I think
states.
it's a great comparison.
And so I think one of the things that I remember is like early days in Bitcoin. For a lot of people, it was a bridge too far, a bit too crazy. And I think, I understand that some people feel that way now about this idea of creating new countries. And I think what people missed about Bitcoin in the early day is, well, I'll give an example of a lot of people, let's say 2012, 2013, even 2016. Um, they wanted to do things that were more like traditional finance fintechs. And one like model I've come up with for, well, what did people really miss there is that something like PayPal is a essentially a layer three. So what do I mean by that? Well, you have the Fed as a layer one. PayPal is in its own bank, so they have like a charter bank. They don't even have their own bank. They have a partnership with a bank they work with, and then on top of that, you have PayPal. So PayPal was a layer three. Bitcoin was a layer one. And I think a lot of people, it's like, okay, that sort of makes sense now. But, I found articles where, 2013, PayPal spent $800 million acquiring Venmo. What if they had taken that money and done something, in the Bitcoin space? And I use that not just to pick on PayPal, but I think an awful lot of people in Silicon Valley, they they wanted to do like what we've been doing. They wanted to do what we were comfortable with. Bitcoin seemed a bit out there. It seemed a bit crazy, et cetera. And we look back at like, okay, well, why was, I would say in the long term, probably if they had put $800 million into something like trying to do Coinbase, they might have been Coinbase plus PayPal. Probably would have been a lot better than being PayPal plus Venmo
I think so.
monetarily. Um, and, I mean, obviously, a lot of these people are way smarter than I am. But, I think that's sort of what happened. And then, so I think you'll probably see something similar with network states where you're going to have a lot of people saying, like, okay, well, how do I take these network state ideas but make it something kind of like what we've been doing?
Mm.
And I mention this because, there's a lot of people that are involved in, investing where, for them, like SaaS to not even Bitcoin, but like SaaS, software as a service, to Web3 was kind of like a stretch. And now, if you start talking to them about new countries, it's like way out there. So I think you will have a lot of people that they'll miss the boat the same way they did with Bitcoin because they don't understand where it's like, okay, well, the fundamental value of Bitcoin was that it's this alternative to governments, that it's a real layer one, and that when you expand on that concept, I would say what you get is not software that the government runs to make the experience of getting a driver's license more efficient. What you get is something that combines ideas, land, hardware, including buildings and robots, and software and community. And that without that layer one or zero of ideas and land, there's a bit of a glass ceiling on what you can do. And of course, there will be people that make money off of coming up with software products that make current governments a little bit more efficient. But I've thrown around this joke of the problem with the Death Star wasn't that it wasn't efficient enough.
Mm,
The problem was there were some other problems. So I think a lot of the real value here is going to come from those that realize what we really need is an alternative to current governments. And so I actually I sort of have this kind of controversial idea, but borrowing from Peter Thiel's chapter of we've had a lot of innovation in the world of bits, but not in atoms. Um, that yeah, the real value generation at this point is probably doing something that isn't just software. So I actually see software as a layer three after, the ideas and the land and the hardware. And I think a lot of people, the same way they focused on PayPal and, other traditional fintechs, they're going to say, okay, well, what's the SaaS project that I can do that's related to a network state? And
mm.
that will sort of miss the boat because it's essentially a layer three.
Wow, you really got me thinking on that. The first thing I'll say is there is so much value. It's hard to put words around the physical connection of having shared a shared place, shared land. Like I do believe there's value in communicating in cyberspace, but in my experience, just last March, I started going to these Bitcoin conferences. I was a Bitcoiner for years before that, but I was in my bubble. And I feel personally that my growth as a human and just my education in many areas, not just about Bitcoin, has accelerated so much by surrounding myself with other people that are pushing forward, not letting the current paradigms like hold back what the future looks like. And I really like how network states are a progression of the concept of Bitcoin in a way. Obviously, it's not just Bitcoin.
Sure.
And I think there's also a conversation to be had about Bitcoin versus crypto. Like there's the Bitcoin maxi, all crypto is a scam thing, which to be honest, I tend to align with. But at the same time, I'm not an idiot. And I know that the market is what the market is, and you can't change that. So the market says there's value in Ethereum, there's value in Ethereum. Who am I to say otherwise? Um, the question that I want to get to, which is off topic of what I just said, but what are if a network state gets to the point where it's negotiating or discussing with a sovereign nation around like actually being recognized, I think it's diplomatically recognized. What are some of those stipulations or requirements that a network state would need in order to be successfully established?
It's a really great question. Before I answer that, can I say one thing about what I said
Of course.
before?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, with the whole idea that I gave before about, projects that are only software being a
Yeah. Yeah.
layer
Yeah.
three. Um, so, like an obvious critique that I've thought of is that of what I just said is that software scales, land doesn't. And I totally understand that. But I guess what I would say, and you were talking about, going to Bitcoin conferences versus, having Bitcoin, learning about Bitcoin, is that I think I've realized there's this idea of things that are useful and common are a lot less valuable than things that are useful and rare. So when everything that I talked about before, it is definitely true that network states and startup societies are going to have a lot of challenges that a SaaS company does not. But the way I see things working is that, whether it's, we already use Bitcoin. Um, you know, you're not the biggest fan of Ethereum. I'm sort of like in the middle. Uh, there's people that use Ethereum. Like there's a lot of, there's all kinds of software tools that are already working. But if I were to ask you, where are places in the world that, the land, the hardware, the ideas and principles, and the software are all like working together as a cohesive unit to do something together? It's like almost nowhere. And certainly not like very much at a country level. Maybe someone could say Singapore or something like that. But in general, it either doesn't exist or it's very rare. And so that's just something I wanted to point out. And then, so yeah, moving on to I think your question was essentially what would a network state need to have uh, to for a legacy country to negotiate with them?
Yeah.
Is that yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I guess the obvious first answer would be something that's of value to that country. So I do think that network states are going to innovate an awful lot on a variety of things for governance, and that there will be an opportunity to sell that to or partner with legacy countries. So I touched before on this idea of proof of identity for who you're letting into your country. So one idea that's more technology based is in the future it's very likely we'll see AI that we confuse with a human. So I think a network state might be better positioned than a lot of countries to figure out some solution to, okay, how do we have a proof of human thing that you're Kyle and not some sort of AI Kyle. And I think that's something that a lot of current countries probably wouldn't be as well equipped to develop as a network state, and then would like from a network state. I think
Interesting.
I've also heard this idea from Balaji of that the best experts in cybersecurity right now work in Bitcoin and crypto, because essentially if you hack my Pinterest, it's like, okay, well, you get like my pictures or whatever. But if you hack, a cryptocurrency exchange or something that has like digital assets, well, suddenly you get billions of dollars and not my pictures. So that essentially, because of this, things that are aligned to cryptocurrency and network states will probably have some of the best cybersecurity experts, and that could be a benefit to larger countries. So I think there's an awful lot of things. It's always hard to predict the future, but those are sort of a few ideas that I've heard, and that I'm repeating.
I'm curious to learn a little bit more about this proof of human concept. Like, why is that important? And what are the consequences of not having a good system for verifying if a human is a human?
Yeah, so I'm definitely no expert on this topic, but I'll try my best. So I mean, as I understand it, it's okay. Like how would it work for identifying who's who? I think in the beginning, there is definitely this bridge, right, between the that I keep talking about between network states and fiat countries, and you're going to have the same thing, between the coming into AI world versus the AI world, and the your blockchain identity versus your human identity. Um, but I think it is generally important to have at least some. Maybe it's pseudonymous, not anonymous, and by that I mean maybe there's some kind of a reputation that I have that you can see. Uh, that maybe if it's a doctor, okay, maybe you don't need to know the doctor's name or where their family lives, but maybe you do need to know that they have a record of, successfully creating, doing surgeries. So I think there's different levels to the proof of human, where part of it might be pseudonymous, and then part of it might be like actually are you a citizen of our network state? Do we let you in? So I think some of that might be okay. Someone gets some kind of a crypto credential, NFT, etc., that you can use as like a passport. So that can be one way. Uh, at the network school, they were happy to say that they were using a low tech solution of wristbands to see like who was in the group or not. We definitely had people showing up who hadn't been accepted, who wanted to be involved, and that was interesting.
Fascinating.
So I mean, I think there's in terms of like competency, safety, I think there's a variety of reasons why you might want to have at least an idea of someone's track record, if not some sort of proof of citizenship, proof of human. I've definitely heard this idea that you might have perhaps you have a NFT and VR glasses that allow you to see, where the building is that's part of your startup society or network state. That if you're not a member, you don't see it. It just looks like another house or
Oh,
something like
wow.
that. Um, I mean, honestly, I think a lot of this is going to be experimenting and seeing what works and what doesn't work. Um, but and then, yeah, I guess another thing for proof of human would be, you were already asking about, what would negotiating with a legacy country look like? And so this, I'm also taking a page out of Balaji's book here to give him credit. But, there's this idea of a network state having a sort of census, and that the census could show, how many people are in your network state, how much capital is in your network state, how much land is in your network state, how much, what kind of skill sets are in your network state. And so I think showing all of those things would probably help prove, legitimacy as a sovereign entity to a country. Now, I mean, that said, I think there's definitely going to be some legacy countries that are way more open to this than others. You mentioned Balaji's podcast with Palau
Hmm.
already. I think there's definitely going to be a lot of countries that are not going to be very interested in recognizing network states. But I think in the same way that, El Salvador started recognizing Bitcoin as a currency, you will have some countries that start eventually recognizing network states as a country. But you're right; they will probably have to show some sort of a value proposition to those countries.
Fascinating. I see it as like if you look at where the most safe places to live in the United States are, there's also this song that just came to mind by Jason Aldean called Try That in a Small Town. I don't know if you've ever heard this song, but uh
Seems like it might be country or something like that.
yeah, it's a country song. But yeah, the
Okay.
idea is that, as and I looked it up here, there is correlation, right? As societies grow, as cities grow, crime rises, and largely I
Mm-hmm.
would attribute that to the lack of accountability for people. Like if you live in a big city, you break in somewhere and go back down 20 minutes to your house, you're never going to find that person again. But if you're in a small town and some crime happens, like people are going to figure out who did it at a
Sure.
much higher rate. So that could be part of the proof of human value. What is and not only in safety but better services like you mentioned, if you know a doctor, like they don't necessarily need to disclose all of their personal information, but they can disclose a verifiable record of their history as a doctor, relevant information to somebody who's seeking their services. There's
Sure.
doctors all the time that are notorious for malpractice, or Uber drivers that are doing things that they get away with over and over again. I guess Uber has the reviews system, but I've had Ubers pick me up and it's a different driver than I have on the app, and I'm like, well, what's going on here? So there's definitely a lot of value in all those things. Is I just throwing this out there? Is there any relationship with Nostr and network states?
Not that I'm aware of, but probably.
They just seem very aligned.
So in the case of the network school, they were using Warcaster and Farcaster
Okay.
some. And yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely. Uh, I guess I'm not aware of the details of how that's working, but basically, yes. I guess would be the real answer. I think network states definitely involves a lot of like parallels and alternatives, including media, and obviously social media is part of that. Um, so yeah, no, I think there's a lot of that, and that might actually be part of the part of the solution for the safety and the recognizing people, et cetera, that we could have would include things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that came to mind because I watched a presentation at Adopting Bitcoin that Max DeMarco mentioned on the most recent podcast,
How do
around.
you? It sounds like you might know more about Nostr than me.
Oh
How
man.
do you see that sort of fitting in there?
Well, it's a right. It's a decentralized internet protocol. and network states is a decentralized network, right? In some
Yeah, yeah.
sense. So I just wonder if there's anyone in the network state community building or innovating on Nostr, using Nostr as a platform to create some of these services that maybe you mentioned around proof of human or verifying things like whatever it might be. Even this is outside my realm, but tokenizing things, the NFT concepts like the passport concept. I read something about like a mixed reality passport, things like that. But yeah, so I guess to wrap up here, I'd like to just hear your thoughts on El Salvador. And if you could compare and contrast 2014 or 2019, 2017 El Salvador versus now, why you moved there and how your life has changed since moving there. That's a lot of questions.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to remember them all.
I'll help you.
So,
I'll help you work through it.
so I've spent about 3 or 4 months total in El Salvador so far this year. So I can't compare my own experiences to what it was like 5 years ago to
Sure.
my own experiences now. Um, I mean, why did I move here? I mean, I've lived about 10 years in Latin America. I've also, spent a lot of time in the US. Those are two areas I've lived in. Definitely interested in Bitcoin, definitely interested in, government innovation. I think in some ways El Salvador has, some startup country dynamics. Not in the sense that it's the biggest hub in the world for startup companies, but in the sense that it's trying to innovate how you would do a country. I mentioned that here this December they've had zero homicides. As a lot of people probably know, El Salvador used to be a very dangerous country. Um, I was just in Colombia for a few months before I came here, where I've also lived there before, and just even like Uber drivers were interested and curious about what Bukele has done here, much more so on the safety side than the Bitcoin side.
Hmm.
Um, so I think all of those things, and yeah, I mean, I guess to me, El Salvador seems like at least a place to check out if you're interested in taking Bitcoin ideas, off chain into other areas. And I think that's what we see some of in El Salvador. Um, and yeah, I've been kind of. I'll see if I can remember them. I was coming up with these.
How has your life changed, or like
How's
how
my
are you
life changed?
feeling
Yeah,
down there? I know Jack Cruz talks about just being in the sun and being closer to the equator. I miss it right now. I'm up here with a little
yeah,
sniffle and just yeah. But go deeper and how are you feeling and how's your life changed?
yeah. No, it is true. I mean, being somewhere in the winter, the cold I can deal with, but sort of the lack of sunlight and the darkness, it can be a bit rough. I mentioned growing up in Maine, and I do as I see people age there, it's not necessarily the place where people age the most gracefully, for sure.
Well said.
Uh, I lived in Colorado for a while, and I think something about the culture of like skiing and mountain biking and rock climbing there, even though they do have a winter, uh, there's a lot of very healthy people who are 65 plus there, more so than El Salvador for sure. So yeah, it is interesting to see where are people healthy, where am I healthy. Um, I mean, I think for me, it's been really cool. So one thing I should mention is, I mean, having spent the 10 years in Latin America, I speak Spanish almost as well as English.
Increíble.
Um, yeah, increíble. So or Chivo. Maybe a lot of people probably heard of Chivo Wallet, but
Yeah, yeah,
if you don't, for those that don't know, Chivo is like El Salvadorian slang for cool.
yeah. In Mexico,
Um,
it's quechito.
yeah, yeah, yeah. They changed the V for the D in
Right.
Mexico. Um, so yeah, I'm just throwing that out there because I do think that I have, in some ways, I have a different experience than some of the foreigners I meet here who live on Bitcoin Beach. I spend most of my time in San Salvador, the capital. I have traveled a lot of places in the country checking things out, but I think the fact that I've lived in Latin America a lot, speak Spanish, etc., maybe it makes it easier in my mind for me to see what's going on here than
Hmm.
for other people. So I love that checking things out here, seeing what's going on. I've definitely felt like it's a really cool adventure, and it reminds me of when I went to the network school. They use this phrase of it's frontier, not fancy, and I think that maybe applies to my experience in El Salvador, where if you're looking to optimize your life for whatever the most luxurious, comfortable, simple thing is, El Salvador might not be the place for you. But if you're curious to see what government innovation might look like, and learn more about a up and coming place in the ascending world, then I think El Salvador would be a great spot for you. Um, I will actually say that for me, some of the health stuff in El Salvador has been a little bit of a challenge. And by that I mean, yes, sure, there's sunlight, but if you don't want to cook every single meal on your own, finding a restaurant to eat at that would fit my description of healthy, which would be a
Not
decent amount of
pupusas.
protein, no seed oils, some fruits and vegetables, etc. No sugars. That can be a little bit challenging. Um, Also, San Salvador doesn't have the best air quality. I'm sort of living on the edge of the city. I think air quality is one of those things that is, the way we look at how people used to fly on planes and smoke.
Mm,
I think that we might in 20 or 30 years look at people who live in cities with bad air quality as sort of a similar crazy thing to do. So yeah, I would say for me there are some challenges with with trying to stay healthy, and that's one of the reasons I think that we need things like startup societies and network states, where when you roll in, it's like, oh well, we've got some healthy food, and we've got a gym, and we got some land in a place where the air quality is nice. Um, so yeah, I mean, I've been loving the adventure, but I won't try to tell everyone that it's perfect for everyone. I try to be clear eyed, not just for myself, but what it might look like for other people. But yeah, I mean, if you want to check out what trying to do Bitcoin related things outside of Bitcoin might look like, I think El Salvador is cool. I mean, there's a Bitcoin farmers market that's great. It's very interesting to see some of the medical laws that they're coming up here, and see where that might go. I recently bumped into Nicole Shanahan at one of the health food stores
wow.
here, and then I think it was like a day or two later, saw like an article she had posted on Twitter that had a picture of her and the president of El Salvador, and other people in that picture. So I mean that's pretty that's kind of like a fun experience to have as well.
That's incredible. Last thing to ask you is if someone's curious to learn more about network states, where should you point them or where would you point them?
Yeah, I would say Balaji is
Yep.
Balaji Srinivasan is definitely the place to go. Most people would just say check out the website, thenetworkstate.com. Um, I would add checking out his interviews. I think he's really very compelling person to listen to on podcasts, and it might just be the way I learn, but I feel like there's an awful lot of depth and dimension and details on the podcasts when it's more freewheeling that you might not get from the book on the network state.
Beautiful. Berkeley, thank you very much for sharing all this. You are a forward thinker, to say the least, and you got me really, really a lot of stuff to digest here. So thank you. And if anyone wants to follow you, are you on Twitter or where's the best place?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, thanks to you for spending time and energy on this. This was really fun. We just met. I guess it was like twice that we ended up meeting here in El
Yeah, yeah.
Salvador,
Once up in Berlin
and
as well, which I didn't get to ask you about your experience there.
and then there's a Berlin and El Salvador
Right.
for those who might not know. And yeah, and then messaging and making the podcast happen. I really really appreciate that. And yeah, if you're looking to follow me, I am on Twitter. Probably the easiest thing you could do would be if you type in berkw.com, berkw.com. That'll take you to my website where I have my Twitter and a bunch of other ways that you can get in touch with me.
Fantastic. And I will be doing a write up for Bitcoin News based on our conversation today and the other research and future research that I do on network states, because I think it's a concept that people are going to be grappling with, thinking about for years to come. And I'm excited for our next conversation when we get a little progress update and get to go deeper on some of this stuff. So,
Yeah,
yes,
of course.
thank you very much, Berkeley, and enjoy the sunshine.
Will do. Thanks, man.
All right. Thank you.